Today we're going to look at 5 facts about Cerinthus the Gnostic, who was one of the earliest heretics from the beginning of the church. And so let's get started. So, Cerinthus, a very famous exponent of what might be termed maybe a sort of Gnostic Christianity or a sort of Jewish Christianity, was very well known in the patristic literature, even though there isn't as much information about him as there is for some of the earlier, or not earlier, but later heretic leaders, like Simon Magus or some of these others. But in any case, we do think we know about 5 things about him, so let's see what these 5 things are. So here's the first fact, his Egyptian origin. So Cerinthus was probably from Egypt, or at least he was educated in Egypt. So this is a map of Egypt that I got from the Egyptian Museum. And this is a map that's from the Greco-Roman period. This is what it would have looked like when he was living. And probably he was hanging around here. If he was educated in Egypt, he would have been educated near Alexandria, which is where all the intellectuals of late antiquity would go to learn and to talk with each other. Although the sources don't say that, that's just the most likely explanation. So how do we know this? Well, the early Catholic heresiologist named Irenaeus made this claim in his book Against Heresies. This was in the first book, in the 26th chapter and the first section. Irenaeus says that Cerinthus was trained in Egypt. So, is this true or not? Well, probably it is true. It would make sense, because some of his theological ideas, some of Cerinthus's ideas, are similar to the ideas that other Jewish and Christian Gnostic thinkers would come up with, and these people were also from the Egyptian kind of environment. So that seems to be where Cerinthus was trained. So, what's the second fact? Well, there's the move to Asia Minor. So at some point, Cerinthus went from this area of Egypt, and he traveled all the way up to Asia Minor, and he did his work here. All the early sources about him, well, they're not really early sources, but the sources about him, such as Irenaeus, who's from the 2nd century, and Epiphanius, who's from something like the 4th century, make this claim about him. Particularly, they talk about his activity in Ephesus, which is a city in Asia Minor. And so, again, is this fact probably correct? I like to think that it is, because we have 2 independent sources, or evidently independent sources, making this claim. Even though they're from his opponents, it seems to be a sensible thing, because as you can see, either by land or by sea, it's not difficult to get to Asia Minor from Egypt, because there was a Roman road going all the way up here like this, and it was very easy to get around. So that's the second fact. Okay, so what's the third fact? He must have been active either by the late 1st century or the early 2nd century. That's what scholars seem to say. This was the time of his theological career, and the more specific date range that people will sometimes give would be from 70 to 110 CE. So this is the guess that scholars make, and they make this by working backwards from the claims that come from his opponents, like Irenaeus and Epiphanius. So this means that Cerinthus would have been active after the time of the Apostle Paul and the other apostles. He could have been active right after, or it's possible that he could have been active right at the end of their ministries, depending on which of them might have been alive. So we know that the traditions from the middle of the 2nd century and afterward place him in competition with the Apostle John. And if that's historical, which we're not quite sure if it is or not, it very well may not be. If this is historical, this would put him at the earlier range here instead of at the later range. But in any case, that's the story. That's the story that the Orthodox give us. So here's the fourth fact: the Doctrine of the Two Gods. So it was said that Cerinthus believed in this doctrine of God. So essentially, the God of Jesus, the Father, was different from the Jewish God, the national God of Israel. So these are 2 different deities in his view, and he's one of the first people actually to be on record for saying this. And this is actually similar to what Marcion would say later and that other Gnostics would say later, that the creator God of the Jews is different from the God that is revealed by Jesus. So here's the fifth fact, which I find actually very interesting. It is his possessionist Christology. So it was said about Cerinthus that he believed in this particular Christology. So in his view, the divine Christ existed in heaven, and he possessed Jesus during the baptism. So when Jesus was baptized, he was possessed by Christ, and this Christ, controlling Jesus, revealed the Father on earth. And then when the ministry was over, when Jesus got crucified, Christ, the divine Christ, left the man Jesus during the crucifixion. So in this view, Jesus was a man who was taken over by Christ, but it was only during the time in which he was revealing the Father. So it's almost as if Jesus' body was incidental, and so it could be discarded when it was no longer necessary. Those are the 5 facts. In conclusion, Cerinthus was a mysterious early Christian teacher who seems to have considered himself to be some kind of maybe a leader of a movement, coming up with his own brand or his own interpretation of Christian doctrine. But because nothing survives from his own pen or the pens of any of his potential followers, it is difficult to know what he did and said for certain. But hopefully you enjoyed this little condensed version of the scholarship on Irenaeus. I got a lot of it from Litwa's 2022 Introduction to Different Forms of Christianity, and you can always go and find that. There are other books about Cerinthus too, and I would direct you to Litwa's bibliography for more information. But until next time, I wish you the best.